Saitama will lose all of his power by the end of the series. That's a pretty loaded statement, and you probably don't believe me right now, so just stick around until the end and I'm sure I'll have you convinced, or at least intrigued. As we all know by now, Saitama is one of the most broken main characters of any manga that's currently out right now, and there has been nobody that's been able to defeat him or even come close to defeating him in almost 200 chapters worth of manga. More often than not, he can just one-shot an opponent and make it to the supermarket on time to get a hot deal on salmon or something. Just another day in the life for Saitama. He of course gained this strength with his iconic workout regimen of 100 push-ups, 100 squats, and a 10-kilometer run every day. After doing this grueling training for 3 years, he eventually removed his limiter and literally became limitless. Well, what if I told you guys that this was actually only temporary, and that Saitama being a hero is actually going to eventually lead to him losing all of his strength? And I'm gonna go as far as to say that it's going to be God himself who makes this happen. To fully explain this scenario, I kind of have to backtrack and explain a few things, like the existence of the limiter and monsterification, so you guys can fully understand where I'm going here. So to briefly explain, Dr. Genius was actually the first person to introduce us to the limiter or the existence of it when he was explaining it to Zombie Man. This is when he describes the limiter as being a biological cap to how strong any living organism can be. This is apparently to preserve that organism from further damaging their bodies by overexerting themselves. What's really important here is that in his wording when he's explaining this, he explains that God put a limiter on every living being. Now at the time, the word God could have been easily replaced with like nature or evolution or something like that, but now with the present context of God essentially being the final big bad of the series, retroactively this statement holds a lot more weight. This is the basis to a major theory that God is the one who created the limiter in the first place in order to keep humanity weak, and also make it to where monsterification could be possible in order to further destabilize the human race. Now I'll explain what the limiter has to do with monsterification in a second, but essentially what you have to understand here is that if this is true, then that means that God had some kind of influence over every living organism at some point and was able to place a limiter on them to pretty much keep everyone from potentially becoming Saitamas themselves. Now how does this all relate to monsterification? And by extension, what does this all have to do with Saitama losing all of his strength? Well, we're about to get there. Dr. Genus also describes monsterification immediately after he explains the limiter. This is when he describes monsterification being possible by a mutation in a living organism's cells that causes rapid transformation. A lot of the times in humans, this transformation is triggered by strong negative emotions and a desire to transform. So essentially, if you really wanted to learn to skateboard and you just couldn't learn how and just sucked at it, and it really bothered you, you could theoretically get so frustrated with not being able to skateboard that you straight up turn into like a skateboard monster or something. Then you could fulfill your dream of shredding a half pipe, but the problem is that you won't be able to become as good of a skateboarder as you potentially could have as a human, because when you monsterify, you also lose the ability to obtain further growth. It's essentially the monster version of a limiter. This theoretically is also said to be God's plan in order to make any living organism on Earth stay within a weak range. Now where the limiter and monsterification start to intermingle is in the concept that heroes and other superhuman-like figures in the One Punch Man manga have also all undergone some form of monsterification. And if you think about it, it's the only logical way to really explain how people like Pig God or Super Alloy Darkshine can possibly exist. They literally push the boundaries of what is even humanly possible. Pig God can quite literally eat anything and never become full. Darkshine has a nearly impenetrable body to the point where an entire building falling on him doesn't even leave a scratch. It's especially apparent in the S-class heroes who have these insanely superhuman abilities, aside from like the A-class heroes who have, you know, pretty insane abilities themselves, but for the most part it doesn't take you that much to convince somebody that they're just a regular human. So okay, now assuming that this is true, the only difference between someone becoming something like Pig God and just becoming a straight up monster is more than likely the negative emotions attached to this transformation. So essentially, if you have a will to become something different, to improve yourself or become something stronger or on a higher level than you currently are, if there aren't negative emotions attached to it, then you do transform, but in the more practical sense, like building your muscles, getting smarter, things like that. So following that same line of logic, that basically means that any superhuman abilities or superpowers in the One Punch Man world are a result of God. These were all mutations that were made possible by him directly altering the biology of living things. Now, how he was able to do this exactly, it's still up in the air. We don't know nearly enough about God to even understand what his intentions are. All we do know is that for some reason, he's looking to create these ultra powerful beings and control them. But the fact of the matter is, if God is essentially responsible for superpowers and super abilities in One Punch Man, defeating him could theoretically make these things not exist anymore. So take the scenario where we're at the end of the series and it's Saitama versus God. Saitama, of course, is never going to lose in the manga, so even if it's a hard-fought battle or a crazy epic fight that spans multiple dimensions and all this crazy stuff, at the very end, once Saitama defeats him, all of his disciples that he granted power to and all of his influence would theoretically be erased from the One Punch Man world, including monstrification and including the limiter. So if everyone and everything is essentially reset to their base forms after this would also include Saitama even if he did remove his own limiter. If the origins of superhuman strength and superpowers are tied to God, then Saitama would theoretically lose his abilities along with everybody else and become a regular human. Now you might think that this is kind of like a sad ending to the story, but let me remind you guys that Saitama at this point feels hollow inside, feels like nothing left to excite him, like there's no battle that he can possibly ever feel excited in anymore because he's way too strong. So imagine the scenario where everyone's reset to their base forms pretty much, but this time they don't have any limiters. I'm pretty sure Saitama would find a ton of excitement in the fact that he now has to train again in order to become strong again, and he'll now have opponents that are of equal strength to him, and he could finally feel the enjoyment of breaking new limits and becoming stronger once again. Just imagine in the very last chapter of the manga, after Saitama defeats God, maybe he's still bald, but he's just as weak as he was in episode 1. And the final page of the manga is Saitama warming up for his 100 push-ups, 100 squats, and 10-kilometer run routine, once again starting his journey to become the strongest.